In October of 1962, Soviet Union leader Nikita Khrushchev planted nuclear missiles in Cuba 103 miles from United States borders. Nikita Khrushchev and Fidel Castro came to an agreement. Fidel Castro wanted to protect Cuba from any more pain the United States might cause. Castro asked Khrushchev to install missiles able to reach United States territory. Khrushchev thought about it and agreed to Fidel Castro's request and soon sent missiles to be assembled in Cuba. Rudolph Anderson, the pilot of the American U-2 spy plane, which made a high-altitude pass over Cuba on October 14, 1962, photographed an SS-2 medium-range ballistic missile being assembled for installation. He had made the high-altitude pass because President Kennedy had failed with the Bay of Pigs against Cuba, and we needed to keep very close surveillance on Cuba's actions. The CIA kept close watch after they found out and placed all the photos and evidence they had in a room where they could examine it. The Soviets were coming into Cuba to help them fight, and the CIA knew, but they didn't know how many. The CIA only thought 6,000 to 8,000 troops from the Soviet Union were stationed in Cuba, when there really was about 40,000. They threw the CIA off with checkered shirts to make them seem like they were civilians, and others wore Arctic equipment to throw off their scent. The missiles were brought to President Kennedy's attention on October 16th at 8:45 a.m., 2 days after the discovery, by National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy. He immediately called together the executive committee to discuss the situation. President Kennedy noticed his options and knew he needed to make his decision before anything worse were to occur. His options were to have an airstrike destroy all the missiles, give Cuba and the Soviet Union stern warnings, set a naval quarantine around Cuba, or have the United States invade Cuba. He chose to set up a naval quarantine around Cuba and said to the Soviets, "We were ready to use military forces if necessary." The Soviet Union saw this as an act of war and were ready to defend themselves by coming closer to starting a nuclear war. This was a political and military standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union. President Kennedy kept the crisis under wraps to citizens of America because he didn't want the Soviet Union and Cuba to find out what he knew. He decided to let everyone know October 22nd at 7:00 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
My fellow citizens, this government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Upon receiving the first preliminary hard information of this nature, last Tuesday morning at 9 a.m., I directed that our surveillance be stepped up. And having now confirmed and completed our evaluation of the evidence and our decision on a course of action, this government feels obliged to report this new crisis to you in fullest detail.
Many were worried not only for themselves and America, but also for President Kennedy. He had gotten himself into so many confrontations with other countries, especially Cuba. This confrontation was not very helpful, involving nuclear weapons. On October 22, 1962, President Kennedy declared the United States wouldn't permit offensive weapons to be delivered to Cuba, and he demanded the Soviets would stop construction for the missiles in Cuba. A few days after he announced the crisis, the Soviet Union sent President Kennedy a compromise. If the United States removed their missiles from Italy and Turkey, they would remove their missiles from Cuba. President Kennedy was considering this compromise before one American U-2 spy plane was shot down. This leaned President Kennedy into a negative answer towards the compromise. The Soviet Union knew they had to defend their alliances. They had to protect all alliances, no matter how small or far away the country was. They knew that more people against them wouldn't end quite well when one of them were angered by them. He also knew the United States was upset with Cuba. This is why Khrushchev added that the United States is never to invade Cuba to the compromise. Still, we had turned it down because of the American U-2 spy plane being shot down, killing those inside the plane. The fight was not stopping. The more we waited to fix the situation, the closer and closer we got to a nuclear war. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet Union had something else to worry about, the Cold War, which was a war between the United States and the Soviet Union about economical and political clashes. This war took place both before and after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Robert Kennedy, President John F. Kennedy's brother, had enough common sense to know the problem wasn't being abolished. He decided to take matters into his own hands and set up a secret meeting with Anatoly Dobrynin, a Russian statesman and Soviet diplomat and politician. He was the Soviet ambassador to the United States from 1962 to 1986, which is more than 2 decades. Robert Kennedy wanted to stop this entire crisis, so he asked Anatoly Dobrynin for another compromise. Robert Kennedy asked for Soviet missiles to be removed from Cuba land. Anatoly stuck with what Nikita Khrushchev had asked for: removal of United States missiles from Italy and Turkey to the promise to never invade Cuba. They both thought they had fair compromises and shook hands. Soon enough, missiles were being removed from Italy, Turkey, and Cuba. The 13-day crisis had ended, and the United States had dodged a nuclear war. We had come to DEFCON 2, which is one step away from nuclear weapons being fired. This crisis was the closest we've ever been to a nuclear war. The population of the world sighed in relief of no nuclear war. Nikita Khrushchev states that he and the Soviet Union won the Cuban Missile Crisis because they had gotten what they wanted: removal of the United States missiles from Turkey and Italy, and the United States promising to never harm their ally, Cuba. July 25, 1963, in Moscow, the signing of the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty occurred after 8 years of negotiations between the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union.